Thank you everyone for joining us for the July 2025 Castle Studies Group online Zoom talk with our slightly idiosyncratic setup for today with my laptop and mobile device both working at once. But the real star of the show, of course, is Colleen Zori, who will be talking about some recent excavations that have been going on in Italy at San Giuliano. So without further ado, Colleen, over to you.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for having me. I'm really excited to share with you some of my ongoing research at the medieval castle of San Giuliano. This is located just a bit north of Rome in the Lazio region of Italy. This work is part of a larger international consortium of researchers who are under an umbrella through Baylor University. So we run this actually as a field school that students can participate in. So you'll see some pictures of students working. And our aims for this project really are to understand the long-term and what actually ends up being cyclical occupation of the San Giuliano Plateau and its environs, beginning as early as the Iron Age and then up through the abandonment of the San Giuliano Castle in around 1300. So today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the goals of our project and actually give you a little background too on some exciting finds that we had this year regarding the Etruscan occupation of the site. And then we'll talk a little bit about models of incastelmento, or basically encastellation, I guess, in English, that are being tested at San Giuliano. And these are relevant to other Mediterranean sites of the Middle Ages as well. Then we'll take a look at some of the defenses and the construction of the castle, which of course, like its brethren throughout medieval Italy, is not like a Disney castle, but is instead broken into sort of different various portions that are within an outside curtain wall. We'll take a look a little bit at daily life in San Giuliano. So we'll look at the hall and the chapel that have been the focus of our excavations. And then I want to run some ideas by you all regarding the how and why of the site's abandonment. And I'd like to make the case that it was actually intentionally destroyed in the late 13th century. So, and run some ideas by you about how that might have happened. Okay, so to begin with, San Giuliano is located about 70 kilometers northwest of Rome. You can see it there. It's in a highly volcanic landscape. In fact, those lakes there, Bolsena, Vico, and Bracciano, are all volcanic calderas that during the time of their eruption, Lake Vico is the one that's closest to us, and it erupted probably about 150 to 200,000 years ago. It spread pyroclastic flows of heterogeneous volcanic material over this area. This is known as tuff, or tufo, we call it in Italy. And this provides then the landscape that was then cut down by a variety of different rivers, leaving behind a very irregular, fantastical, beautiful landscape of plateaus and deep ravines. And that is indeed where the people of this region made their homes. So you can see here, the San Giuliano Plateau is, you can see it in sort of framed by other settlements that are currently inhabited. One of these is, you can see up in the upper left, that's Blera, and then Barberano Romano, which is where we make our home while we're working at San Giuliano. Both of those are located on plateaus, but one thing you might notice is that they're actually plateaus that are sort of inclines. They sort of ramp up, and then the original medieval habitations would have been at the most defensible far ends of these plateaus. San Giuliano is different in that it is a freestanding plateau. So it was actually more defensible, and that was probably strategic for a whole variety of purposes. You will notice, however, it has slightly less area than is available on those other plateaus, which may in part be why it is abandoned and inside of the current Parque Marturanum, which is a regional park, which has been both good and bad for the archaeology. It means that no one's living in it, no one's living in that medieval habitation zone, but it means that we have more trees there than have existed in this area since the Bronze Age, probably. And so the roots, unfortunately, do a number on this tough archaeology, the Tufo archaeology. So I want to sort of contextualize how San Giuliano existed as a site on the borders of very important political entities throughout its whole existence, but it never was a sort of central player. So it's an important hinterland site, but in part because of that volcanic landscape, it was difficult to incorporate this area and bring it into a single political organization. And so because of that, San Giuliano represents a really fascinating mixture of influences that were sort of ebbed and flowed throughout its history and that shaped the culture and the people's lives who lived there. So we can go all the way back to the Etruscan period, in which the site of San Giuliano existed. Oop, where's my arrow? There we go. In the hinterland of Tarquinia and Treveri, who were two very important coastal sites. They had big harbors. They were important players. They were part of the League of Etruscan Cities. And so beginning in as early as the Villanovan period, which begins about the 10th century BC, the site of San Giuliano was getting influences from both the western coastal region, but all the way over into the Adriatic and into northern parts of Italy. And so these cultural influences sort of eventually coalesce into the Etruscan culture, but the San Giuliano site was sort of always in a bit of limbo, in sometimes allied with Treveri, sometimes more heavily influenced by Tarquinia, possibly sometimes under their various political control. So again, this represents one of these moments of political eddies and currents through the site. And why isn't my site doing? There we go. Okay, so then with the emergence of the Roman Empire, we see that the Romans conquer, they go a bit north, but they actually are not powerful enough yet to conquer the Etruscans. So they conquer the city of Veii, but they're then stopped just a little bit south of where our site was located. And they sort of conquer to the south before they return in the late 3rd century to begin to exact their control over this region. So we know that during this period of time, the site of San Giuliano appears to have been relatively depopulated for a variety of reasons that we'll talk about. And then it was then later that the site became important because it was on the corridor between Rome and Ravenna during the period of the Byzantine attempts to reconquer Italy. The Lombards have come down from northern parts of Europe and have established a variety of duchies in the Italic Peninsula. And so this was an important area that was kept open so that Rome and Ravenna could have open lines of communication. And we'll see how, in fact, the site of San Giuliano was in some ways perhaps torn between these Roman or papal, emergent papal influences with then those of the Lombards. And in fact, there's evidence of both from our region. And then finally, of course, the Papal States. It's always been, this site has always been part of what's called the patrimony of St. Peter. They owe particular things to the papacy, right? They have to pay annual dues. They owe them military service. And the papacy is responsible for administration of justice. But this was also a time period in which there's a lot of influence coming down from the Holy Roman Empire. And in fact, there are battles nearby here. So this is again an area that really would have been, it's a bit of a distance from Rome. It would have taken a while to get there. It's in a forest that even the Romans were afraid to try to conquer people who lived here. And so again, it represents this kind of, there would have been many different influences coming through, but again, very hard to control this location. So as I mentioned, I'm going to talk just very briefly about the Etruscans, mostly because it's very cool and exciting. So you can see here the site or the plateau of San Giuliano is highlighted, outlined there in red dotted lines. Some people think it kind of looks like a footprint. And you can see that by and large, many of the tombs of the necropoli cluster around the eastern end of the settlement. This is typical of both Villanovan and Etruscan sites where the tombs form a necropolis that's sort of like a ritual halo around the habitation plateau. We've excavated a handful of the earliest tombs there. These are transitioning between the Villanovan culture and the Etruscan culture. These are trench tombs for single individuals. Here's one example. This is a little girl's grave that we just published last year. She was between 2 and 4 years old when she died, and she's richly appointed with lots of bronze objects, bracelets, armbands, fibulae, and even they're hanging off of her, one of the fibulae is actually a duck axe, which has been interpreted by Etruscan scholars as representing her potential role as a priestess, had she not have died so young. Within a generation or two, however, the folks that lived in this area began creating larger tombs that were family tombs. These were the large tumuli, and you can see that's tumula cima. They're cut into the bedrock. It's very elaborate. And then chamber tombs are cut into the rock itself. The same for, this is tumula cucumella. That one's made more out of blocks because there wasn't quite as much bedrock there. But one of the things that's quite interesting about these is, again, how they cluster around that eastern end of the settlement. And these reflect what seem to be large sort of kinship groups or family tombs. Now, the area that's highlighted there in white, we already knew that there were some unusual tombs there, that little line of tombs leading up to the plateau, because they faced inwards rather than towards the plateau like everybody else. And so we began to excavate in that area, hoping we would find a sort of funerary road. And we did so in 2024 and found a looted tumulus that had been previously unknown. And then this year, we actually found one finally that is unlooted. We started work here in 2016. And so this has been a big, exciting adventure for us this year. So you can see here on the left is the tumulus that was excavated in 2024. That one you can see is cut into the bedrock. They just sort of made a depression. They sort of separated the tumulus from the surrounding bedrock. And then across the street, the funerary road, is the 2025 tumulus. And this is a LiDAR reconstruction of the interior of the tomb. And I find it quite haunting that even though the bones, the site unfortunately had, or the tomb had unfortunately been flooded periodically. And so the bones were in really bad shape, but you can almost make out the outlines of the bodies of the people who laid there. It's almost a little bit creepy. But our preliminary osteological analysis suggests that there was a male and a female individual laid out on each bed. There were 74 plus ceramic vessels in the tomb. These are still undergoing analysis, but they include the local red impasto, the black Etruscan bucaro, which is sort of their famous export ware, and a handful of pots that were in the Italo-Corinthian style. So these are vessels that are being produced under strong Greek influence in southern Italy. So this tomb really represents in some ways that coalescence of the Etruscan funerary practice. These tombs, like all of the later tombs, have a sort of a pitched roof. They look like houses on the inside, and then the couches or beds are meant to represent, of course, how you will go feasting into the afterlife. So this was a very exciting find this year. But it was in part the result of our survey work, which has documented over 600 plus rock cut chamber tombs. These date to the 6th and 5th centuries BC and contain many of the Greek fine line vessels that the Etruscans are so famous for having purchased. So here's a couple of examples of those tombs we've excavated. Even though they're previously looted, they still contain a significant amount of information that we've been able to use to address questions of, the numbers of people who are using them and their relationships, as well as the types of artifacts that might have been included in those burials. So as I mentioned, the Roman occupation of San Giuliano appears scant. So there's little to no evidence that people were living up there. One idea has been that perhaps the site of San Giuliano was bypassed by the road system. So the Via Cassia and the Via Clodia go on either side of it, following the terrain that's a lot more amenable to road traffic. It may have even been bypassed because it was a relatively powerful Etruscan center. So this may have been sort of efforts by the Roman Empire to alleviate or sort of diffuse some of that Etruscan power. However, it's quite interesting that then the medieval inhabitants of the site make a lot of use of Roman materials. Some of this was spoliation of architectural materials. So you can see there at the bottom left, there's a white marble column that's included in the San Giuliano church. There's also Roman roadstones, which I'll be coming back to in greater detail, as well as some Roman artifacts, including bronze coins and a Roman gaming piece that I think actually both were probably used as gaming pieces, since the bronze coin wouldn't have had a whole lot of monetary value in the medieval period. But these are part of then the patrimony of the people, the medieval people living there, making use of this settlement that had previously been occupied by the Etruscans, and then they would bring actually materials from Roman sites up there as well to use. Okay, so now we've gotten up to the medieval period. Let's take a look at some of the models of encastelmento or encastillation at San Giuliano. So our initial, there's sort of three initial models that we wanted to test. The first was whether or not it was the product of public or state power. That is to say, whether this was perhaps fortification that was constructed by the Byzantines or by the Lombards as they were trying to control this territory. We know that there's a Byzantine chapel at the site of Blera, which is just up the Via Clodia from San Giuliano. We know that there was actually a Lombard fortification that was built at the site of Barberana Romana. So this area was heavily contested by the Byzantines and Lombards. However, we'll see that the time period occupied our site appears to be occupied doesn't quite work with that. And nor does it really make total sense for the Papal States or the Holy Roman Empire to have constructed this. It sort of straddles these different periods. So the state power model has not seemed to be quite as reasonable. There are some hypotheses that there's more of a bottom-up type effort for the construction of these types of fortified medieval settlements. And so we have actually texts that tell us that, interested or concerned residents or property owners could build territory, or could build towers, could build fortifications in order to keep their sites safe. And then those can then be sanctioned by rulers or archbishops or whoever sort of has the power in that area. So that still runs as a strong possibility. We know this was happening in Tuscany in particular. But probably the most likely model is that of its construction by feudal lords. So in the Middle Ages, this area was heavily contested between a variety of powerful families that were consolidating control through a variety of mechanisms that would bring under their control, their legal control, these various castles. And these would include the Anguillara family, who are based at the Lake of Bracciano, the Prefetti di Vico, so the prefects of Vico, which are at Lake Vico, and then the Orsini family coming out of Rome that had settlements in Bracciano and also ultimately some power in Viterbo as well. So in this case, it would be a private elite, warrior elite that would monopolize this power to build forts to dominate and protect people and resources of the lands and extract resources from them. And this may have been particularly important in periods of time when the papal power was relatively weak. What's also sort of interesting about this period, and what's been sort of an interesting concept that I want to sort of take forward, is that of who actually managed these castles. So in his recent book, The Signorial Transformation, Alessio Fiore wrote that it was better for the leaders of these territorial principalities to maintain direct control over their castles rather than grant them in benefice. it was far more expedient to entrust men of humble rank with guardianship duties than high-ranking individuals, as the former were easier for the Lord to control. So I'm going to be making an argument in regard to the construction and then subsequent use of this castle, and who might have had domination there. Okay, so then I was going to show you some maps. So here is medieval Italy through 1154. So we can see that area again, still considered within the Papal States. It's highly contested, particularly under Frederick Barbarossa, between the HRE and the papacy. And then it really, again, sort of as Italy sort of parses out into its the sort of emergence of the city-states in the later medieval period, this area, again, it stays under papal control, and perhaps as the papacy continues to emerge as more powerful, would have come under greater sway and control of that area. Okay, so let's take a look at the medieval remains on top of the plateau. So the San Giuliano plateau takes its name from the Church of San Giuliano. This was constructed primarily in the 13th century, although there is some evidence of some earlier construction there. It's been heavily remodeled and repaired and restored, I guess. But you can see that two of the three aisles, or I guess one aisle is there, and then the central nave, and then there was one aisle that's missing. And so this site, this chapel actually remained in use into the 1950s. There were actually people still living up in this area. So that remained in use even after the site itself, the military site, was abandoned. So we'll be focusing primarily on the medieval fortifications in an area known as La Rocca, the rock of San Giuliano. And this is essentially the heel of the footprint, which is also the highest point on the plateau surface. You can see that in the topo map that's located there at the left, so La Rocca. And we can see then that the eastern end of the plateau, the natural fortifications are augmented there, and that continues around the southern edge. And you can see these walls have been restored, but there's some additional parts where the original masonry remains, and it's really quite remarkable. I hope you can kind of make out in that picture on the bottom right that the mortar is really, really good. So the blocks are wearing away, the tuffo blocks, but the mortar remains. And this is an ongoing question that we have about the site, and we'll take a look at some of the ways the mortar was prepared here in just a moment. You would have the modern road that we now take to access the site follows a different track than the medieval road, which hugged the base of the plateau. But where those two come together now, there are a series of gates. So at the left is the first gate you would come to. This is right where the modern track and the medieval track come together. So it actually incorporates Etruscan blocks in it as well, suggesting that this is longstanding fortification of the plateau. But the medieval site would have then been accessed by this very narrow gate that is very heavily infilled, that is shown in the picture at right. So this gate would have had an arch that went over top of it, and there would have been a low ramp or road that would have then enabled vehicles and horses and humans to access the site. Then kind of as you continue around the top of the plateau to the part where the heel print is separated from the rest of the footprint, the natural defensiveness of that part of the site is augmented by the excavation of a dry moat, or some people have called it a killing alley. So this would have just augmented the defensibility of that western portion of the site. So you can see that dry moat there in this map, and the walls go all along it, although they've been broken in part by the construction of the modern road. But here you can then see the layout of the fortified Acropolis of La Rocca. And this entails the construction of a hall, a chapel, and this tower. which I'd like to start off by speaking about. So the tower base is still standing, and you can see that there on the upper image on the right. We've done some reconnaissance excavations and have not found, so we've got basically the southern wall and the western side, but we don't have the eastern corner or the northern corner. So it's difficult to know precisely how big the base was, but it's probably greater than 5 meters on a side. This is pretty typical for the towers of this region of Italy in this time period. These towers were a key symbol of wealth and power of the elite class, but they also would have had a functional value. So they would have served as lookout towers to identify the site on the landscape, as a weapons platform, and as a stronghold in the event of a siege. So some of these towers could be as tall as 25 or 30 meters, which we think our tower easily could have been. In part, it was supported by a strong foundation that entails a rubble core, which you can see in some of the areas where the exterior blocks have fallen off. So what you're looking at there, particularly there to the right, is the really strong mortar that has been poured in, and then rubble that's sort of been poured around it to form that core. Then the tower continued up with a double wall and fill style architecture with, again, this extremely strong mortar. And you can see a chunk of it in the lower left image here. That's one of the corners, so more durable. The tufo really varies in the degree to which it's highly vesicular or more dense. And they actually went and selected more dense forms of the tufo to construct the corners, which were even better shaped than the blocks that were used in the rest of the wall. So these coins were essentially would have served to strengthen the structure. And then you can see also that the tower would have been partially plastered. So the plaster is sort of slapped up there, and then they draw the sort of fake lines on it to outline where the blocks were. This is to make up for the fact that the blocks are not as neatly quarried as some of the other ones in the construction of this site. So the plaster is used liberally to sort of smooth it over. And then we think there were likely crenulations at the top. We found a series of well-shaped blocks that had been that were shaped on all 5 of the 6 sides and were heavily plastered. So those would have been along the top. And here's a drone shot of our the hall, the tower, which unfortunately can't see from the trees, and then the chapel over there on the side. And then a 3D model of the various parts of the site. And I've outlined in the chapel portion the outline of the chapel on the apse, but also a very large rectangular hole that exists about 1.5 meters outside the door of the chapel. And we'll return to that in future slides, but just so you can kind of keep in mind where it's located. Okay, so let's take a look at the hall. The hall is about 7 meters wide and about 14 meters long externally. It has an elaborate entryway, which you can see there at the west. So this image is, north is up in this image. So the entrance is to the west. The floor there is plastered. There's an elaborate peperino, which is a heavier volcanic stone threshold that has various closure mechanisms, and it's got those little walls. To the north side of the doorway is the base of a stairway that would have gone up to a second floor, which is typically where the action took place in these kind of medieval halls. The downstairs may have been used for storage or keeping animals, although we haven't found evidence of this, or there may have been sort of, casual living that took place there, feasting, that sort of thing. At the southwestern corner, we found a small enclosure that may have been a guard room. And like many medieval sites, it is filled with pits. The medieval people loved to make various holes for various purposes, but I want to draw your attention to 2 specifically. One is located west of the front of the hall, and was a granary that was later used for trash deposition. And then one to the north, where you can see there's just the faint image. You can see the ladder that extends down into it. That hole is about 5 meters deep, and it is actually been enlarged from an Etruscan water management system known as a cuniculo. So down the shaft is a tunnel that during Etruscan times was designed for getting water off the top of the plateau during the heavy rains of the winter, and sometimes actually even the summer too. And that was kept open and expanded during the medieval period. Basically every other hole on this mountain, on this top of this plateau, has trash in it. But this was kept decidedly open. There were virtually no medieval artifacts at the bottom. And the tunnel leading off to the side actually goes to the edge of the plateau, which is where perhaps people could have escaped. And in fact, we do know from various Roman sources that they would sometimes use cuniculi and their tunnels to breach cities under siege. So the reverse could also have been true, that it could have been used as sort of an escape hatch. So the dates we have for the hall suggest that there may have been an earlier occupation there, maybe even of wooden structures that predate the hall. So this is the dates we get from a pit that range anywhere from 800 to 900 AD. These are probably too early for the Lombards and Byzantines, but the stone construction of the hall, we believe, took place probably around 1100, maybe a little bit earlier. And that's given by the dates from a variety of animal bones that have been sampled from the occupation surface of the hall. Other information about the chronology of the site come from that granary that I mentioned that's out to the west of the main hall. And like others of the region, it has very specific morphology. So it has a square cut at the top where the lid would have gone, and then a narrower collar that then spreads out into sort of a vaguely arebuloid shape. And you can see our students there excavating it with a tripod. This was filled up about a third of the way with faunal remains and broken ceramics and glassware and other types of waste. And then the rest was filled in with blocks from the hall, which I will come back to. But they give us some ideas of the dates of the final occupation of the site. This was probably the primary place for trash deposition. It shows good evidence that this is where they were disposing of, for instance, like freshly butchered meat. The other types of archaeological sites have shown that these were frequently cleaned out. And so we think that then the dates that we're seeing here, that you can see there below, are from some of those last days of occupation of the site. So they overlap quite nicely with one another, but it seems to indicate that the site is abandoned before about AD 1300. So there are numerous aspects of the hall that suggest that the person who was responsible for its construction had some good degree of economic power. Like other medieval military sites in this region, the hilltop was brought down to bedrock and then leveled prior to its construction. This would have been a huge undertaking, but it allowed them to construct foundation trenches that they would then set the foundation stones in. This is really important in a place that's tectonically active like central Italy. The walls are made of a high quality and quite uniform double wall and fill masonry. You can see some of that in the drawing below. So this site really, I mean, these walls are so strong, like we still walk on them, which you're not really supposed to do at archaeological sites. But it really is a fabulous mortar. It's quite good. And it's holding up really well. And so it really suggests that that entire structure was built by someone with some degree of economic wherewithal. That's supported by the use of on-site mortar mixing stations, which you can see here. They kind of have a D shape, and then excess mortar has been sort of pushed out of them. And this is in contrast to the use of mortar mills that were more common in the 10th century. It was only higher status folks that would mix their own mortar, that had the manpower and the economic, that they could support the production of their own mortar. And so mortar mixing stations begin to become more powerful as some of these powerful castles emerge. However, I want to make the argument that the people who continued to live at this site had an idea of what was good. They knew what was elite, but they couldn't always accomplish it. So we know from the faunal bones we have from the site that meat was plentiful, but that it was used strategically and economically. So they generally are preferring sheep over goats. They are probably using this to produce dairy, so cheese, particularly the pecorino that this region is famous for, and that they were probably also producing for wool, and that they were primarily managing their herds or their flocks to promote the survival of the female sheep. They were then the ones that would then get eaten, but not until they were quite old. There was a preference for immature pig, however, like many sites, and actually like our diet in central Italy, even today, we eat a lot of pork, and they were also hunting for wild boar. And then for cattle, it was more rare, but they were primarily keeping females, and they often bear the signs of arthritis in their distal extremities that suggest that they were probably used for traction prior to being consumed. So this really speaks to sort of an economizing consumption strategy by which animals exhausted their economic potential before they went on to the dinner plate, with the exception of those baby pigs. Drink consumption, so we have over 750 shards of glass. I've done some analyses of these, and the majority of them are involved with drink consumption, so wine most probably. So many, close to 50% of the shards are from beakers, like the ones on the left, many of them are printed, which would have enabled people to sort of hold on to them a little bit more easily. And at the right is an example of our finest piece of glass. This is a form of cristallo that was leaded, very clear glass that was just starting to be produced in Venice at this time period. So probably some of the last bits of glass that were discarded at the site. But kind of like we saw with the meat, these folks were also economizing when it came to their glass consumption as well. So it turns out that very, very clear glass to the right is among some of the only totally clear glass that we have at the site. In fact, most of it is weakly colored and has abundant evidence of recycling. So in the price documents from this time period, for instance, there's one from Bologna, we find out that actually clear glass costs about a third more than the cloudy or weakly colored glass, green glass especially. And so this was something that, the folks here, they knew what was good, they knew what was prestigious, but they can really only afford the kind that's been recycled. We have some evidence of leisure activities being conducted there. These are some examples of knights, chess pieces from the throughout various places in Europe. Chess is introduced through contact with Islam. And most of these are made of really nice bone or antler, or sometimes ivory. And so perhaps you will be unsurprised to find out that the knight that was recovered at San Giuliano is a more modest, rustic type of production. It was made from a deer foot, so dama, a small deer, small red deer, and it is considerably more, perhaps more rustic than its counterparts. So this, however, is, I think, an important testament to the fact that the people who were inhabiting the site knew what was good, knew that this game of chess was prestigious and it was something they knew about, but the style testifies to more local style production. And actually, we took some samples of it this year, so we'll get some radiocarbon dates on it shortly. I'm very excited about that. And one final example is one of the only pieces of metal vessel that we have found from San Giuliano. It's a piece of a small goblet. And initially, I had thought maybe this was pewter, because pewter goes, it sort of expands out of the ecclesiastical world and becomes accessible to elites in Italy, beginning in around the 11th century, 12th century. However, pewter is usually tin with variable percentages of lead, and copper present only in about 1 to 5%. But our analyses of the cup show that it's mostly copper, with just enough lead and tin to make it look silvery. So this is again an example of almost sort of a knockoff, right? Because tin would be harder to come by. It has to come from further away. Copper is available more locally, and so is lead. And so there's enough of that mixed together that whoever was making the alloy was able to create something that looked silvery, but isn't. Quickly, I want to just introduce the chapel. It comprises a narthex with medieval masonry walls that have 5 primary and several ancillary grave slots, but it's tacked on the front of what appear to be the foundations of a large monumental Etruscan structure. So perhaps some degree of continuity of ritual happening there. And then you can see outlined in white, we have 46 mostly east-west tombs that are cut into the bedrock. However, the remains of more than 100 individuals. And part of that is because the tombs were extensively reused. So you can see there at the left, that's tomb O. The final occupant was an adult male, mature individual, but you can see the skulls of 4 additional individuals, and some of their long bones had sort of been piled up over his feet. So had been original occupants of the tomb. On the right is, again, that's an awful lot of femurs. It's like a bone quilt that was pulled up over the remains of the final individuals to be buried there. And in fact, what you can see here at the top is, up near the north arrow, is the thorax and upper limbs of an adult male, but his lower half of his body has actually been moved, and a juvenile individual, 5 to 7 years old, was laid in as the final occupant. So sometimes they didn't even fully move them out of the way before they put the new person in. So your tomb was not your own. Once you were decomposed, you were kind of moved to the side, and that would then allow for an additional individual to be buried there. Also exciting this year, we found a Roman altar stone at the eastern end of the chapel when we were clearing it. So you can see there, it's on the left. It has a patera, which is a sacrificial vessel that was a bowl used for making liquid offerings. You can just make out the very faint remains of an inscription, a Latinate inscription on the side. We haven't been able to decipher yet. But it was reworked along its top, and following other examples from the region, may have served as the support for an altar stone. So this makes, again, for this idea of continuity of ritual practice, quite interesting. And also, again, this would have had to come from kind of far away. There's nothing nearby here that would have this type of altar stone. So again, the medieval folks are manipulating and moving materials around the landscape to suit their own purposes. And here's one other fun artifact from the chapel this year. We found a small pilgrim's badge. This is lead. Our XRF analyses show that it's lead. And what you can see here is an individual who is seated. It's meant to show it in perspective, which is quite fascinating. It took me a minute to figure out that those weren't his legs. Those are his knees with the folds of the fabric up over them. He's seated in a chair, bishop's chair, and he has a mitre, a bishop's hat. And in his, to the left side, you can see he has a mitre, or a crozier. And what's in his right hand was very puzzling, but we've seen some additional examples now, including this one from Ariano nel Polsine, which is in the northern part of Italy, where we believe what it is a key. So a big medieval key. So here we're looking at St. Peter and evidence of pilgrimage connections between San Giuliano and the St. Peter's in Rome. Okay, so the abandonment site, as I mentioned, before 1300, this is due in part, we believe this because of the C14 dates, but also the ceramic and glass styles. So here are some examples of protomaiolica, and then what are called toed glass vessels. And these really show up, become more prevalent around 1300 and after. And these are absent from our site. Virtually, we have maybe 1 or 2 pieces of protomaiolica, and we don't have any evidence for these toed vessels. So it really looks like people are gone from there after 1300. So we've been hypothesizing about how and why. The first model is that it was slowly depopulated, maybe with gradual decay over time. But I think the evidence seems to point more strongly to relatively sudden abandonment, although perhaps revisited and continued use in certain ways. So we'll be taking a look at whether we think this is an earthquake or if there was more purposeful destruction or slighting of the castle site. So it's rather mysterious. I've never worked at an archaeological site where everything was uniformly leveled out to 2 courses of stones. And it was really quite fascinating, this area. We know that there was agriculture taking place on this plateau prior to when it was made into a park, but not on this side of the tower mound because it's a relatively narrow little sliver before you fall off the edge of the plateau. So it is not from the action of agricultural leveling. Blocks from the specific masonry style of the hall were deposited in the granary, as well as the cuniculo, which you can see there at the middle. So they were both filled up almost to the brim with these type of blocks, which is hard to account for them just falling in there naturally. And in fact, several of the blocks that were in the cuniculo were too big to have gone in crosswise. They would have had to be sort of levered in. And in fact, at the bottom of the cuniculo, when we got down to the bottom of it, it was just jumble of blocks all the way down, no artifacts, just blocks. And they were quite, they weren't very well connected to one another. There were lots of voids, and it really sort of pointed to strongly sudden deposition. And then some of those blocks were mortared into the bottom of the shaft, which again testifies, I think, to it being intentionally closed. And then we've argued that maybe the flooring may have been robbed out. We haven't found evidence for flooring other than some broken floor tiles, but the floor could have been something perishable. The chapel was actually blocked by chunks of the tower. So you can see the view there looking out on the left-hand side, and then that big block of tower. It actually hit the church and knocked it a little bit off its axis. So the wall to the narthex in the front is a little bit off. And at that time, or shortly thereafter, the tiles slid off the roof and they landed on the occupation surface on the north side of the chapel. And then the back side of the church was, I think, opened so that people could access it and remove materials or visit their dead or actually start burying additional people. And they robbed out a number of those blocks. So I want to focus in the last bit here on the tower collapse itself. So when I first came to San Giuliano in 2016 and began excavation of the hall, the tower is just on the other side of this hill, which I thought was a natural hill. Of course, you'd want to put your tower on the top of it. But it became increasingly clear that this is not a natural hill at all. In fact, it's comprised entirely of the rubble of this tower. So the chapel is off to the left-hand side. You can see our safety netting there on the side. And we excavated it in 2022. We excavated it by hand. So you can understand that this represents a huge investment of effort. We did it in sort of a terraced fashion, but you can see these large chunks of this tower having toppled down here. They comprise almost the entirety of this hill. So you can see some examples here of the chunks of the tower, and then sort of more naturalistically arranged bits of tower blocks, so individual tower blocks. But once we cleared these off, it was the occupation surface right underneath it. And so it became increasingly clear that a lot of the rubble from the tower had been captured by a very large hole that was excavated into the bedrock just outside the door to the chapel. And this has been very difficult to understand. There's little functional need for a big hole right there. We only have the eastern and the northern edges of it with bedrock. The southern side and the western side are the trench walls. So unfortunately, we don't know the full extent of it. It's about 10 to 15 meters away from where the base of the tower was, but it's the fact that it contains this tower rubble is very provocative and interesting. So here's our 3D model. You can see that we've had to actually put in some fencing to hold that in because it's so unconsolidated. And this is what it looked like when we were digging it. I mean, it really looks like the tower collapse happened in a single episode of destruction. So there were lots of voids. There was no consolidation. The soil matrix had absolutely no organic content to it. It was essentially just regolith. It was not reflective of standard long-term forest soil formation processes. And there was an absolute absence of artifacts. They did not accumulate over time. This was not the normal way that sites form around here. This is basically what we were looking at was destruction that happened within a very short period of time and then existed under the surface that was undergoing its standard soil formation processes. So you can see as it filled that hole, you can see those blocks just going down, 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 all the way down. That's about almost 3 meters deep, or 2.5 meters deep. All right, so did the tower fall down from an earthquake? There is none recorded in this region in the medieval period. There is a possible earthquake that happens in the 1340s. It's a little late for when we think the site was abandoned, and it appears to have been concentrated further north. This is at right, you can see some pictures of what happened when Barberano Romano's tower collapsed in 1930. It was an octagonal tower. And one of the things that's kind of interesting about this is that it's not directional. It goes out in all different directions. It collapsed into individual blocks rather than into big chunks of masonry. But you can see that the base is still intact, like ours is also. So I'm making the argument that maybe there was more purposeful destruction. So the tower at San Giuliano collapsed in a directional way. It collapsed only to the north. The tower blocks are not found in the hall. And in doing brief inspections of the east and the western edges of that artificial hill that is tower collapse, it basically all went to the north. So the tower sticks out of the southern side of this hill, and then all of its rubble goes to the north. The rubble included those individual blocks, but these large agglomerations of the blocks held together by that really strong mortar, and the base is still intact. And one question I have is whether or not that collapse was intentionally captured by that large pit. Was this part of perhaps siege tunneling or mining that would have brought down that tower in the direction that people wanted? And here's just a couple of images from the medieval period of various tunneling activities. I want to bring in one more interesting phenomena, which is the presence of Roman road stones at San Giuliano. They are all made of basalt, which is extremely heavy. So these blocks weigh between 50 and 150 pounds. They're polygonal, but you can see they've got, so they're not so good for doing architecture. And they had to be excavated and transported to the site because we don't know of any Roman roads on the site of San Giuliano itself. The closest would be from the Via Clodia, which is 2.5 kilometers. The Via Cassia is 4 kilometers, and they are indeed made of these polygonal basalt basalt. You can see there at the road on the left. So these are found wherever we have the blue stars, and this does not include all of them because we haven't been able to shoot them all in with our total station, but they are found in the construction rubble outside the hall. They are deposited in the granary among blocks from the hall. They're found near and just past the chapel and around the southern edge of the plateau, but they are not found inside the chapel, with the exception of one that was used to close the door, like post-abandonment. And they are not found on the north side of the plateau that we can see. So it's my hypothesis that perhaps these were being used by some type of siege machine, perhaps a counterweight trebuchet, to bring down the tower. And we know that the trebuchet was in use in Italy, perhaps even earlier than this, but these are the ones that are commonly cited in documentation. The circle around the plateau there is the 300-meter limit that would have been sort of the best functional use of the trebuchet. Probably it would have needed to be closer. This then, the hill to the south, which is basically where the rocks would have needed to come from to knock the tower over to the north, is quite accessible and would have been an excellent location from which to perhaps attack this site. One problem is that these are the examples of trebuchet projectiles that I've been able to find archaeologically recovered. They range from, in terms of their location and their primary material, but they're quite a bit rounder than the Roman road stones. However, I think those things are so heavy, those basalt stones, perhaps they still would have been able to do good. One last piece of evidence we have for the conflict that may have led to the final abandonment of the site are the presence of bodkin points. These are iron arrow points that are found in a variety of different locations. There's 27 of them in total that we found in the course of our excavations. They have multiple different morphologies, which suggest they had either different manufacturers and assailants that were using them, or that they also had different functions. So it's been said that some the longer, skinnier ones are for penetrating chainmail, and the shorter, fatter ones are used when you need to puncture plate armor. And you can see they range in lengths, although there's sort of two concentrations in sort of a smaller and then a more sort of medium sized within a handful of quite long ones. And you can see the nicely restored one there down at the bottom right. It's a little bit difficult to make out because it's so small, but they are found within the structure of the hall and in its surrounding areas. So just to put this in historical context, we don't have any known texts dealing specifically with this castle or even its specific area, but it was enmeshed in an area that had this complex web of power. So of papal authority, of the emerging communes, and of the wealthy families that were connected sometimes to both. So to the Pope, to the papacy, as well as to the administration of these different towns. So the power of the papacy was increasing in the 13th century. And so perhaps the destruction of this site was in part to control this area and to sort of take away its ability to foment rebellion or to resist the papacy. It could also be that the site of Viterbo, which was growing in power during the 12th century, they were trying to spread what's called the contado, which is their area, their hinterland area. And they were doing this through control over regional castles. And we know of at least 5 that were being contested, and they were using a whole variety of different methods to control them. But that this area was also contested by a handful of regional families. So remember that the site is located sort of between Vico and Bracciano, which were the bases of powerful families, such as the Anguillara, which their crest is shown up there at the top. It has 2 eels. Anguillara is an eel, and then a castle next to it. And then Vico, and this is actually the castle of San Giuliano, which is located just about 10 kilometers from San Giuliano, that was at one point controlled by the Prefetti di Vico, and then the Orsini family as well. So there's quite a lot of possibility or probability of people that may have wanted to destroy this castle and perhaps even accomplished it. So future work, we're looking to excavate this, finish the trench at the eastern end of the chapel. It's set off from the surrounding bedrock by a large, deep trench that may have served may have been part of the Etruscan occupation, may have been part of the defensive function of the site as a whole, but cut through a handful of Christian burials. So may have been something that happened quite late, perhaps in the lifespan of the site. And then we are going to do some ground truthing of a possible medieval village site. So you can see our GPR ground penetrating radar taking place there at the top right. And then at the bottom are some suggestive linear anomalies that could comprise a village site to complement the work that we've done in the Acropolis. So that will be great for comparison in terms of diet and also their experience of the potential destruction of the site. So I will stop my screen sharing now, and thank you to all of you for your attention. And I'm happy to take whatever questions that you might have and thoughts about whether or not Roman roadstones would make good trebuchet bullets.